So here we are with Jennifer Whitacre. I really look forward to this interview. Jennifer has a lot to share, and we have a lot to uncover within mental health and how you can provide transformation within your own life through many different obstacles, many different routines that are available out there, many different resources that Jennifer is going to provide. So first and foremost, I think we'll speak about really how you came into terms of what really these self-development problems really offer and why people really want to improve themselves throughout their day, why people want to seek change within their life. And a lot of it can be due to a traumatic experience. It can be due to childhood trauma or an experience that you had in your past that necessarily you could not overcome, or you can't necessarily find out the answer as to why. For yourself, Jennifer, what did you experience as a child, as an adult, that caused you to try to understand more about human development and trying to see what you needed to improve upon yourself?
I don't remember when I actually became consciously aware that I was on this path for healing. I have known in the background, just in the back of my mind, most of my life, that something's just not right, something doesn't feel right, something's off. And a little bit about my experience. As a child, I grew up in a household where, by today's standards, both of my parents would be considered abusive in very, very different ways. My mother was passive aggressive to the point that she would say things under her breath that only you could hear. And I don't know if you've ever been around that type of personality, but it's really, really exhausting. And whenever you finally do speak up and, try to set a boundary and say, leave me alone, or stop saying these things to me, then you become the ass because nobody heard everything leading up to it. And so it looks like you're the one making the scene. So you put that personality with my father's personality, and my dad is prone to losing his temper and going into rages and tantrums. So when you get this little biting comment under your breath, coming at you on a regular basis, he would handle it as best he could. And then next thing we knew, sometimes it would be weeks, sometimes it would be months. There would be a big blow up in the house, and there was usually a fight. There were often holes in the wall that I remember when I was a kid, just from the blowouts and the fights. So there was a lot of angry yelling, a lot of verbal abuse, a lot of financial manipulation in my household. And it set the scene for my sister and I, because there were only two children. It set the scene for my sister and I to have to walk on eggshells around our parents. We were conditioned to accept bad behavior from our parents. Therefore, we thought that was normal. And when we went out into the world, bad behavior from other people was our comfort zone. So that's what we were attracted to, and that's what we were drawn to. And, I get into high school, and I found myself in dysfunctional relationship, one after another. And it did. It started when I was in high school, when I started dating. My high school boyfriend cheated on me. He was verbally abusive. I was right back at him because, again, that was my comfort zone, and that's what I knew. And I very quickly became jaded in life about relationships. So I went through this phase where I was kind of a man hater. I thought men were crap. And again, that came out of my abuse. That's not really how I feel. It was, I had that belief for a period of time because I was not ready or willing to look at the pain of my own experience. So I projected my own experience out onto the world, and I unfairly projected it just at every man I encountered for a long time.
Thank you for sharing that, Jennifer.
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciate that. And there's really two themes that I think that come out from this. And one being that when you have a traumatic experience, whether it be an abuse, whether it be a substance abuse of yourself, whether it be a mental health condition, they always seem to recur if you don't necessarily find, say, the answer, you don't step in at the right time, because it creates those kind of negative self-beliefs, those negative doubts. So it's kind of a recurring issue. And the other part is, it kind of completely changes the way that you see abuse and the way that you see just living a normal life, because like you said, it ended up affecting you to then be abusive on other people. So
Mm-hmm.
it can not only recur throughout, one event, but it can lead to, say, five. And then it can as well make you be, your own proponent to really being the abusive, subject. And you could be bringing that upon someone else. So,
Mm-hmm.
how can someone, if they do have one traumatic experience, obviously it's hard to necessarily find the answer as to why someone else was doing it, but where can someone seek acceptance and seek a way to necessarily, find a way to not let one experience lead to the next, or create that self-belief or self-doubt in them to act upon that aggressively towards someone else?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, there's a whole lot going on in that question. So first of all, you referenced, like our bad behaviors or maladaptive behaviors. And I hate to use the term bad, but they do come across as bad behaviors in general society. So a lot of our behaviors, trying to think where to begin to answer this. Let me take a step back. First of all, you mentioned a few times a traumatic experience. I do want to clarify what I mean when I talk about trauma, because I've done a lot of professional education in my life, and I have become a trauma specialist, and I specialize in understanding and working with childhood and intergenerational issues. And so when it comes to a traumatic event, you can have 100 people live through the same event, and you might get 15 to 20 of them, roughly 15 to 20% might experience the symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress. So it has to do with your resilience. And a lot of times it does have to do with childhood, goes back to childhood issues. And what happens in childhood is all mammals and birds experience this, not so much reptiles, but mammals and birds. We cannot survive without our parents. And it's hardwired into us as infants to attach to our parents or guardians or someone who's going to protect us, because without that attachment, we cannot survive. And as an infant, we don't have a cognitive brain that's online. Our neocortex is not finished developing. Our hippocampus is not finished developing. So it's somewhere around 3 years of age that the average person starts to have memory recall. Most people can't recall memories between, prior to that. And that's because of how our brain develops. So prior to that, we're absorbing all kinds of information and we are learning left and right. We are just not doing it with our cognitive mind. It's our subconscious mind, our implicit memory that's absorbing all of that information. And implicit memory and subconscious memory is tissue memory, cellular memory. It is the memory of the body, and it becomes a habit. So what happens in infancy, as an infant, when we go into the fight, flight, or freeze response, if there's no adult that comes to us to comfort us, and we don't get what we need, we start to compensate. So you might have an infant in the crib, and we're, 5 decades into doctors telling us to let your babies cry it out and let them fall asleep. Turns out, from a trauma perspective, that's terrible advice, because it creates attachment issues between the infant and the child. And whenever you layer those early attachment issues with repeated trauma throughout somebody's life, it just grows and gets worse. Those are the people who are more likely to cope and create behaviors that they take into adulthood, like I did. Because with an infant, again, it's hardwired into us. It's not a conscious choice. We just know instinctually that survival is more important than authenticity. So the child will always come to the conclusion that I'm not lovable, I'm worthless, I'm not good enough, I have to compensate in order to maintain the attachment to my parents who are going to protect me so I can survive, because survival is that important. So once we use these coping mechanisms in childhood and they work for us, so some of those coping mechanisms might include becoming the really good girl and becoming the nice person and the considerate person, and you're always like taking care of your parents or doing exactly what they say, even though you might not want to, because it keeps you in favor with your parents. And then we become the people pleaser or the yes man or the high achiever whenever we get into adulthood, because it worked for us in childhood. And we don't realize that in adulthood, it's killing us. In childhood, some kids turn to eating. Some kids will sneak candy. Some kids will sneak food. And that can change and adapt as the person grows to become a substance issue or an overeating issue or an obesity issue. And so it's knowing your past and looking at the truth of your past. A lot of us like to tell the story that we had a happy childhood and that, oh, my childhood was wonderful. And they're completely denying some incidents that could have, created some of these patterns. So it's looking at the truth of what really happened and going back and getting beyond the story you tell yourself. Because so many of us have stories we tell ourselves. That good girl, that considerate girl, I was that person for so long, and I created this story of how considerate I was of other people. And the truth is, I was lying to myself. And it's not that I'm not considerate. Don't get me wrong. I do have a streak of consideration in me. It's just I misused it because that consideration, I used it to help me mask whenever that shame from my earlyhood childhood trauma would come up. So let me give you an example of exactly what I mean by this. When I was a little kid, about 5 years old, I'm 5'6", I'm not sure. I kind of go to 5 because I don't remember exactly when. My father asked one night, "Where do you want to eat?" And I said, "Long John Silver's." Don't judge. It was, 35, 40 years ago. It was 40 years ago at this point. And the food sat under the heat lamps. The chicken planks were chewy. They weren't good. It was really gross. But I had my little basket of extra Crispies and my Heinz ketchup. I didn't care. I was happy. And we sat in the booth right in front of the quintessential bay window of the Long John Silver's restaurant. And my dad started complaining about his food. It wasn't good. His food ended up hitting the window pane and landing in the windowsill, and he sat at the table and pouted the whole evening. Meanwhile, my mom, my sister, and I had to finish everything on our plate. Regardless of how hungry we were or not, we had to finish everything. That was everybody's punishment because I chose this restaurant, and the whole entire weekend, not just that evening or just in that moment, but the whole entire weekend, I heard how stupid and selfish I was for choosing that restaurant because my dad's food wasn't good. So it became my fault that his food wasn't good, and it was my fault that he wouldn't eat that night. So his pouty response became my fault and my problem. So I very quickly learned, don't ever, ever, ever choose where somebody else eats. So I became the considerate person. So if you asked me when I was in my 20s or 30s, where would you like to go to lunch? My response probably would have been, I don't know. I'm not really hungry for anything in particular, Brendan. What do you think? What sounds good to you? I'm not familiar with the restaurants on your side of town. Suggest something. And then you could narrow it down to your favorite restaurants. And if I picked, it was still your choice. And that became a problem in relationships. It's caused arguments with, in my relationship where I wasn't able to just order food in a snap because we were in a bind, and it was like, hey, will you go order pizza? Everyone's hungry. I'm like, no, what does everybody want? I wanted to take orders. And it should have been a situation where I could have made an executive decision and said, everybody here can either eat cheese or pepperoni. It's good enough. But I couldn't do it because that was a trauma response coming up. And it really took me getting tired of my own crap and looking back over my life before I started to heal some of this stuff and recognize my own patterns. So you really do have to get to a point where you're sick of your own patterns, and you have to look at the reality, because for some people, they really truly are kind and considerate without the trauma in their background. For me, in many cases, that kindness and consideration was a trauma patterned response.
Thank
So
you.
did that answer your question?
Definitely. Yeah. That
Okay.
it opened up a lot of different perceptions that I have just now that I'm
Mm-hmm.
starting to see a lot of like, because the trauma driven responses, you can see that they are really driven out through
Mm-hmm.
many years, and they
Yeah.
can continue with you for a long period of time. And just as you said that, my mind was
Mm-hmm.
just
Yeah.
thinking and thinking like, wow, it really makes sense because, even if like when you were saying about how you were deciding on a place to eat, it
Mm-hmm.
can change the opposite way of you then being more considerate. And
Mm-hmm.
it just really opened my eyes to think that, you
Sure.
experience something such a, negative traumatic experience where, you felt like you were self-worthless, you didn't
Mm-hmm.
belong. And then due to that experience, you then wanted to change your mindset to making sure that everybody is
Mm-hmm.
always welcoming. It's always that
Mm-hmm.
they're going to be the first one. So you always put someone else first, even when you were always the last one
Mm-hmm.
to really receive any type of support and
Right.
help. And
Mm-hmm.
to become aware of that, like you were saying, just creating
Yeah.
that awareness as you go through it to find those habits is the first step.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think for a lot of people, especially today, they could go within 10 years and then they can start seeing that these trauma responses are happening, and then they can
Mm-hmm.
become aware of it. And for a lot of people, it becomes kind of just the daily habits that they can't become aware of. And
Right.
I think that
And yeah, and where it becomes problematic is when you do what I did and end up sitting through several meals throughout your life in restaurants that you would never go to, eating foods that you would never eat, just because you don't have the ability to speak up and advocate for yourself. And I've done that before, just, shut my mouth and end up at a restaurant going, oh, I would never eat this crap. But then, you just kind of choke it down anyway. Um, and so that's really, really important to become aware of those patterned responses. And I know in there you mentioned like substance abuse and addiction. When it comes to substance abuse and addiction, one thing that I would ask any client who has an issue with it is, what does it do for you? Because if the abuse of the substance, even if it doesn't even have to be a substance abuse, it could be cutting, for example. What does cutting do for you? What does the substance, what does the alcohol, what does the drug, what does it give you? Because people don't just do drugs unless it gives them something. It usually gives them some sort of pleasure that they can't get, or an escape that they can't normally get in their life, because their life has become too emotionally painful for them to remain present for themselves in their own life. And a lot of times the substance helps to regulate the physiology temporarily, and then the person can't regulate the physiology on their own, so they keep returning back to the substance. Recently, I had on my podcast an implicit memory expert, and she was revealing a study that they had done on a girl who was a cutter. And they had, tested her physiology, hooked her up to machines and tested her. And, she was just like high anxiety. She went home that night and she ended up cutting. And when they saw her the next day, they tested her again and her physiology was right back down to normal again. So don't get me wrong, I am not advocating cutting. I'm just saying that the body is brilliant in how it learns to adapt. And then once you become tolerant of it, then you have to do something even more to be able to feel and get yourself. So that's where it's important to realize and get intervention and work with somebody who understands. Because if you're dealing with this level of trauma, I would highly recommend a somatic-based therapist, because cognitive behavioral therapy is probably not going to cut it for you.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you for that. Because it
Mm-hmm.
seems like when you're speaking about the substance abuse, it's always when you face an experience that causes this pain that you want to suppress. It's obviously the first experience that someone goes through. They're saying, all right, the first answer really is going to be something that's going to suppress this pain, whether it's taking a substance, whether it's cutting themselves. There's a feeling of, ecstasy that they want to have that necessarily will bring them out of that headspace and that mindset of, facing that reality. And it becomes that dependence that it in turn creates an even more negative approach. I mean, that's why we see
Mm-hmm.
so many people overdosing today. That's why we see so many people that are committing suicide and
Mm-hmm.
ending their lives, because they necessarily are always seeking the next suppress the next level that they can reach in order to not feel the experience that they had originally. For someone that's been into that, um, you know, their own treatment process that they see it as, of using a substance or trying to cause and inflict pain within themselves, how can someone try to change their physiology while trying to mentally cope with that? Because there definitely has to be a multiple level approach to that, because they can't necessarily just end using substances or end cutting
Mm-hmm.
themselves to really try
Right.
to face this issue, because in turn, physiology, they might have some horrible repercussions due to a complete stoppage to this harm that they're causing themselves.
Mm-hmm. I think for each person that's going to be different depending upon what the behavior or the habit is. For a lot of substances, rehabilitation is some sort of rehab facility, so they can detox and withdraw in a safe setting. Might be warranted depending upon what the substance is. And whenever you get out of the treatment facility, because a lot of people come out like really, really convicted that I'm not going to do this again. I'm going to stay clean. And what's really important, in my humble opinion, is to change your environment. Because it's the environment that leads people into substance abuse in the first place. So if you get out of a treatment facility and you go right back into the same home, you have the same exact friends, you're in the same exact neighborhood, and you're doing the same stuff over and over and over again, isn't that the definition of insanity, to do the same things over and over again and expect a different result? You might want to change your environment. You might want to consider, like, okay, do you have a relative somewhere else in the country where you can go stay and get a new start? Or is it possible not to hang out with the same friends and find new friends, go to different places, go to different meetings? So that's an important aspect of it, is changing your environment. And there is a lot of truth to looking at the 5 people that you hang out with the most and really step back and assess their actions, their behaviors, their words, their qualities, their characteristics. And do you like what you see? Because if not, you might want to think twice about who you're hanging out with. And that includes family, because you are the average of the 5 people you hang out with the most. And is that what you want to be when you stand back and you look at those 5 people? So it's taking personal responsibility for yourself, and not just wanting change in your life, but being willing to change in order to accomplish the change that you want. Now, when it comes to cutting, stuff like that, I would definitely recommend finding a therapist, finding someone to work with. And it depends on the severity. For early childhood trauma, and if you've lived through early childhood issues like pre-8 years old and you had a lot of abuse and trauma in your life, I would recommend a somatic-based therapist, because a lot of that trauma just really gets imprinted into the cellular memory and into the nervous system of the body. So it becomes habit, it becomes your reactive behaviors. And these are the things that we just write off as normal. We write them off as, oh, that's just a behavioral quirk, or that's just part of his personality. That's just who she is. And we write it off as if somebody else's poor behavior is perfectly acceptable. It doesn't have to be acceptable, because a lot of those quirky behaviors and personality characteristics are trauma patterned responses that we've just kept because we've never taken a step back to examine our own behaviors or our own beliefs.
That's great. I love those tips. I think those are definitely great ways that someone can take the first steps in order to really try to bring around a great environment and get the firsthand resources. In terms of the substance abuse, I love the environment aspect, because I've seen it a lot throughout where I grew up, there was a lot of substance abuse, a lot of issues within that field, a lot of people overdosing. And if someone comes back to that environment, that hometown, they know exactly who to get the drugs from. They know exactly where to go, and changing the environment is step one. My good friend, Matthew Ray, his family actually offered him basically the answer to his problem, which was, you've been through rehab 5 times. We're either going to move or you're going to stay here and be homeless. So they basically said, we're moving our whole family. We're changing the environment for you. We're making a step for you. Now it's up to you. Now it's up to your choice. And now he's 4 years sober, doing incredible. So it's that change in environment, exactly what you're saying. Like, that's living proof of you need to change who you're around, who you're surrounding yourselves with, the hobbies that you have. There's so many things at stake in the environments that you experience, whether it's substance abuse, whether it's, a traumatic experience. Being back into those places can trigger different instances, and they can cause more harm and cause you to just lead back to a lot of past experiences that necessarily you won't be able to come out of. And in terms of the the mental health aspect of it, you talked about the self-belief and the self-doubt. And I've been reading a book, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, and he speaks about the 2 different systems of the brain. So the fast thinking and the slow thinking, and the fast thinking being, the one that's always the quick trigger of knowing, 2 + 2 = 4, and knowing when you see someone, the representation or the characteristics that you can cause from them. So the quick, fast thinking, the self-belief and self-doubt. And that brings up the instance of, when someone experiences a traumatic issue, they create, and it becomes ingrained into their mind. One offer that I believe a lot of people are using today is these positive affirmations, positive self-talk. For someone who's experienced a traumatic issue, whether it's working with a therapist or working with themselves, how can positive self-talk benefit someone, and how can it change the way that they perceive themselves and maybe perceive the experience that they had?
Depends. It depends on where you are in your process. So if you're in a process where you are suffering miserably and horribly inside yourself, positive affirmations are going to be patronizing, and they're going to do zero good whatsoever. Because that's what I call spiritual hijacking, where you convince yourself that, okay, I'm not really experiencing fear right now. I'm not really experiencing this anger and rage that's bubbling up. I'm just going to positively affirm my way out of it. So what they've proven, and there are books written about this. One of the big ones is Bessel van der Kolk. He wrote The Body Keeps the Score, and he's really, really huge in somatic-based therapies with the research and the work that he's done. He worked, or there's a woman named Janina Fisher that worked alongside him for a while, and she wrote a book called The Fragmented Selves of Trauma Survivors, because it is true that our personalities fragment whenever we experience a traumatic event. And again, the trauma is what happens inside of you, and trauma is anything that limits or constricts your response to a similar event in the future. So it reduces the possibilities of how you can respond. So whenever our parts of our personality fragment, the parts that we learned as a child are not acceptable become points of shame. So we do everything we possibly can to hide them and stuff them down. So if that anger is a point of shame for you and you're positively affirming it away, you are doing to yourself exactly what your parents did to you as a child, and you are neglecting yourself and you're abusing that aspect of yourself. It's not about positively affirming it away. It's about getting to the root of it. And first of all, you have to get beyond the story you tell yourself, because usually there's a story we tell ourselves. The story I told myself was that I was a kind and considerate person. I wasn't willing to get to the truth that that kindness and consideration, that story that I told, was born out of trauma. And now that I've gotten to the root of it, I can respond, I can speak up and say, no, I don't want to go to a sushi restaurant because I don't eat fish, which I have. I've sat through meals eating sushi when I don't eat fish. And so there, so I don't have to put myself through that anymore, because that was a form of self-abuse in order to people please other people. So I can bring that back into balance, and I can still be kind and considerate, but I can still advocate for myself. So that's why I say it depends. Now, if you're not that far down the rabbit hole of trauma to where you're suffering miserably, if you're a little further up and you just have like bad days here and there, positive affirmations could really be a good way out of positive affirmations. So it really depends on who the person is and what they're dealing with. And this is exactly why when I work with clients, I never use protocols until I get to know my client a little bit more. Once I get to know my client, what I'm really dealing with, that will determine what tools I pull out of my toolbox to work with that particular client, because everybody is so vastly different in how they internalize past traumas and how they respond and react to it. So what I recommend for people is to start to gain awareness of your own patterns. When are those moments when you notice that voice in your head, in the back of your head, that's just going, and you're off, you're running your mouth and you're saying, gosh, here I go again. I swore I was never going to get wrapped up in this argument with my girlfriend, Brendan. What are you doing? Or I swore I wasn't going to yell at my roommate like this anymore. Or I swore I wasn't going to talk to my parents like this anymore. Meanwhile, this voice is going, Brendan, what are you doing? I thought you said you weren't going to do this. And there you go doing it. That's your implicit memory, which is your tissue memory, taking over while you have awareness. And have you had that experience? Does that sound familiar to you at all?
Definitely. Yeah.
Okay. So pay attention to your awareness. So when you get that awareness, stop yourself. And you might look like a ding dong, and that's okay. When you get that awareness, just stop dead in your tracks, interrupt the process, and do what you need to do to put a little bit of space between the awareness and the response. So it doesn't have to be, when you're reactionary, it's like this. There is no space at all. It's like event and reaction. It doesn't matter. There's no thought. If you can stop yourself and put just a little bit of space in there, then you can start to have a response rather than a reaction, and you can slow yourself down. And one of my favorite ways to teach people to slow themselves down is through, I'm a certified coach mentor through the Heart Math program, the Heart Math organizations in California. And they teach several breathing techniques. And their breathing techniques, well, like, I'm amazed. They bring the body back into a state of coherence and balance in no time flat, as long as you practice them, because they only work if you use them. And I first heard about the heart math techniques through people like, and let me know if you've heard of these guys, Dr. Bruce Lipton, Dr. Greg Braden, Joe Dispenza. They're all heart math trained kind of celebrities in the world of what they do, you know, with quantum physics and metaphysics and trauma and human history. And that's where I first heard of the heart math techniques and what kind of prompted me into becoming a coach. And I'm just blown away by how quickly these breathing techniques work.
That's awesome. No, it's something that I've understood as I've performed meditation. I try to do it really daily, whether it's, 5 minutes or 30 minutes, just trying to get that time to perform those breathing exercises. It really centers yourself and makes you understand, how you interact with people. I think that's the one big thing of, when you said that, of when you started becoming aware, and that's something that I have is as I communicate with people and how I interact, how I am kind, how I necessarily am, say, angry or mean to some people, and how I'm reactionary in a lot of those conversations, then, sometimes you pick it up afterwards and you're saying, all right, next time this is when I need to improve. But it's, I think, creating that separation in order to, think before you act, think before you speak, because then you can actually implement what you're truly aware and conscious of. It's also very related to emotional intelligence. It's something that is definitely huge and something that I've, there's so much research going on today about it. And I think it's so impactful to understand how you interact, especially within different environments, how your emotions come into play, how they happen due to events with other people. Can you speak about how, whether it's environments change our emotions, but as well, just why the process of becoming aware of our emotional thinking and learning can play such a vital role, in our mental health, really as
Mm-hmm.
a whole.
Yeah. Yeah, emotions are incredibly important to all of us. I think emotions are one of the most important things that we ignore in our normal daily lives. We suppress them, we repress them, we shame people for experiencing them, and they're the one thing that makes us human. Not the one, but one of the main things that makes us human. And they're incredibly important, and I'll explain why in just a minute. So it's really unfortunate that we have minimized emotions. So one of the first things I would recommend people get familiar with is separating the emotion from the sensation from the story we tell ourselves. And every day when I have clients in my office, I go through this process, and it doesn't matter how seasoned you are. I've been doing this work for a while, and I still get tripped up myself. So it's a lifelong process. So I don't want anyone to think that you're just magically perfect at this, because none of us are. It's a lifelong journey, whether you've experienced trauma or not. The story we tell ourselves. So let me give you an example of that. A client might come in my office and I might say, how are you feeling? Or what are you experiencing right now? Or tell me about something, that's activated in you, or something that's upsetting you or bothering you. And the client, and this has happened more than once, a client will come in and talk about an argument that they've had with, a friend or a partner or a spouse or somebody. It's usually a loved one, somebody close to them. And I'll say, well, how do you feel about that? Well, I feel abandoned. I feel rejected. Rejected and abandoned, neither one of those are feelings. Those are the story you tell yourself. Is that the reality? So I will ask a person, how does your body experience the feeling of abandonment? Because I'm trying to get them to identify either a sensation or an emotion. So the abandonment is the story you tell yourself. It goes back to childhood, where you perceived that you were abandoned, or you perceived that you were rejected, or you perceived that you were stupid. And then you took that on and you've carried that story throughout your whole life. So just because you had an argument with your husband last night because he was an hour late coming home from work and you didn't get to go to dinner because it was date night and you missed your date night, that doesn't necessarily mean he rejected you. It doesn't necessarily mean he abandoned you or anything like that. It could be that he got held up in traffic because there was a horrible accident and the highway was a parking lot for 40 minutes. Who knows? It's getting to the bottom of the story. Did he really abandon you in that moment, or is there another possibility? And getting back to the event in childhood that triggered it. Like, when is the first time you felt this? And a lot of times, whenever you get people to identify the sensation and you'll ask them, is this the first time you've ever felt this? No, it's not. I've felt this way my whole life. Well, when was the first time you felt it? A lot of times it just immediately takes them far back into childhood. And then you can start to get somewhere, because then you can start to re-examine that childhood event with adult eyes and with your adult wisdom, and looking at it from not through the lens of, in my case, the 5-year-old who got yelled at because I chose Long John Silver's and my dad's food was bad. I came to all these conclusions through my implicit memory, through the implicit memory of a 5-year-old little girl, and I've carried them with me throughout my life. It wasn't until I really stood back and re-examined them that I was able to change that belief and think, oh, okay, I don't have to be kind and considerate and mask that. Speaking up and saying that's not where I want to eat. Speaking up and advocating for myself doesn't mean that I'm going to hurt or harm somebody else, in the process, which is kind of what I was led to believe. So it's a matter of getting beyond the story and getting to the emotion or the sensation. And that is incredibly, incredibly important in order to heal and move past a lot of these patterns.
Wonderful. Yeah, it seems like it's always a deep-rooted cause that someone needs to start to uncover. And we create, it's so interesting that how complex the brain is, because we create these stories, we create these doubts and these beliefs within ourselves that we necessarily can't come to terms with unless we speak about our emotions, unless we talk through it.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I think, there's so much value in the therapy and the communication aspect of your emotions. I think a lot of times within people's relationships nowadays, it's always, how are you feeling? How are you doing? Good. And it's always just that common cycle of people saying, I'm good, I'm doing well. This is going on with my life or whatever. But it's not, when you sit down with somebody, it's not really like a deep rooted conversation of, what's truly happening, what emotions are you truly feeling? And, whether that's how you seek out with a therapist or not, it's truly so important to understand your emotions and where it's rooted, because like you're saying, it could go all the way back to your childhood. So it can be rooted from something that you don't even remember, but that someone can start to peel back and bring and start to make you become aware of it.
Yes, and our emotions are incredibly important, because when we experience emotions, especially if it's a really big emotion, like if you get really angry, most people know what that feels like in the body. There's this heat that rises up that comes from your core, and you sometimes flush and you just feel it through your whole body. Sometimes your face gets real hot, you start to get sweaty, you tense up. Most people understand what that feels like. Well, when there's an emotion that big, there's a hormonal response and a huge release of cortisol happening in the body. So our emotional responses are directly tied in with our endocrine system. And then whenever the endocrine system gets out of balance, then that spills over and affects every other system in the body. Most immediately, the central nervous system, the cardiovascular system, and the respiratory system. Because they're all tied in together with sympathetic activation. And the emotions are there to give us a warning. So anger is a call to action. Somebody has crossed a boundary or something. Somebody has violated you in some way. So it's time to reestablish a boundary. It's time to end that relationship and walk away. It's time to move on. It's time to reframe it or do something. It's a call to action. Fear is, like, okay, let's do a little bit of orienting. Let's see what's going on here. Am I in danger? Am I not in danger? So these emotions are there for a purpose. And whenever we experience joy and happiness and love and the positive emotions on the flip side, those are things that we want more of in our life, because they help to balance our physiology, and they help to rejuvenate our immune system, and they rejuvenate the cells in our body the more we can experience those, regenerative and renewing emotions versus the depleting and draining emotions. So if you really think about it, the emotions are trying to let good things into our life and keep bad things out. It's our response to the environment. Does that sound like another system in your body that tries to let the good things in and keep the bad things out?
Exactly.
Sounds like your immune system, because our emotions are the immune system for our psyche. And how stupid of us as an entire population to stuff and repress our emotions and not pay attention to them, because when you do not have a healthy emotional state, you do not have a healthy autoimmune system in your body. You just don't.
It shows you how connected and linked our body, our mind is together. It's really something that we need to, always be aware of. And that's the one topic that I think is being brought up today is, there's the statistics that 1 in 5 people suffer from a mental health condition. And a lot of people are responding back saying, yes, but 5 in 5 people have mental health. Everybody has mental health. Everybody needs to focus on it. Everybody needs to start to learn about their emotions, understand them, and really unpack what's going on. And I think that's so valuable, because you see a lot of people today that are saying, oh, this person's suffering from, this disease, this illness, but I'm not, so I don't necessarily need to focus on my emotions, or I don't need to exercise, or I don't necessarily need to focus on my nutrition. But it's an ongoing process. And each day, if you do want to get better and you do want to feel correctly, you want to feel healthy, you want to feel as best as you can, you need to be focusing on these day to day, and you can't You can't stop and
Right.
think that everything's just, your body's going to feel better and your mind's going to be in a whole different place. It's all
Right.
interconnected, and it's something
Yep.
we need to really take control of each day, which I think a
Right.
lot of people, think it's all disconnected, and they don't really play a part into each other.
Right. Well, the gut produces roughly somewhere between 70 and 80% of the dopamine and serotonin in the body anyway. So it's true that the food you eat has a direct effect on your mood. And a lot of people don't believe that. They don't care. It's also true that exercise has a direct effect on your mood, because implicit memory, somatic-based therapy is one of the best ways to work through trauma that has affected your implicit memory, that is stored in your cellular memory, is through movement, some sort of movement therapy, some sort of somatic-based therapy where you learn to be present with yourself. So that's why so many people, once they start to exercise, they'll notice that they have this burst of energy. They start to feel good about themselves. They don't really know why, but on some level, just the movement is working that trauma that's been stored in their body out of their system, and they start to feel good. And then when you start to feel good and you start to care about yourself, you start to watch these feelings of I'm not good enough and I'm not smart enough or I'm unlovable. When those feelings start to go away, or those old stories that you tell yourself and those old beliefs start to go away, then you start to care about yourself enough that you want to take care of yourself. So you look at the potato chips and you're like, that's not really good for me. I know the research, I know what it says. So we know what we need to do to take care of ourselves. For most people, we just don't care enough about ourselves to do it. And so what you put out into the world is a reflection of how you feel about yourself.
Definitely. I love that
Mm.
insight. I think that's a great perspective, and how people need to come to terms in order, self-care is truly a very important task in, your health altogether. That's something that I learned is, you can't help other people before you help yourself. And it's a
Mhm.
recurring topic through, anybody's experiences. You are first and foremost. You can't work, you can't connect with others, you can't do most activities, most hobbies without really being a healthy individual and focusing on taking care of yourself, which I think is
Mhm.
is first and foremost. And
Yeah.
I think this leads to a good transition into a different type of way someone seeks therapy, and
Mhm.
that being psychedelic therapy. So
Mhm.
psychedelic therapy being a way that someone is changing their mindset and their perspective based off of using a substance, which is psilocybin or other types of plant-based
Mhm.
therapies that can offer a different insight, a different perspective into maybe a trauma that you faced, or just the place that you're in, the environment that you're in, and maybe what steps you can move forward.
Mhm.
So can you speak about psychedelic therapy, and we'll speak more about, the misconceptions and really how it's transforming and improving a lot of people's lives throughout society today. But first, if you want to just allow the audience to understand more about what it is, and
Mhm.
we'll dive deeper into the topic.
Right. Yeah. So I have done psychedelic assisted psychotherapy sessions. It's not the same thing as recreational use. And after going through my experiences, I'm more against recreational use now than I've ever been, because so much recreational use is just misguided. Set and setting is incredibly important. And by set, that refers to mindset. So often when people use psychedelics recreationally, that is not the appropriate mindset to set up a healing environment. So if you're at a rave and you're doing psychedelics, you're opening a portal to your subconscious, for your subconscious to be affected by everything in the environment around you. And so all the people at the rave that you could encounter, all the music, everything that's going on, is that really what you want to alter your mindset? Probably not. Or whatever other scenario, festivals or whatever. So I'm not a big fan of that. So with my psychedelic treatments, And just to be clear, so people know, I've done several sessions. And with my sessions, I did a very similar protocol to the FDA clinical trials. Now, I want to be clear, I was not part of the FDA clinical trials, but after reading the research and the results they were getting from the clinical trials, I talked to my facilitator and I did 3 sessions about a month apart of MDMA. The street name for MDMA is ecstasy. Now, if you buy it on the street, who knows what's going to be in it? Because it's probably not pure and you might not get MDMA in it at all. So I was doing a pharmaceutical grade MDMA. And the very first thing I noticed was the MDMA under the right guidance. And I did months of preparation, like a lot of writing and a lot of assignments that I had to do leading up to this. So this was not something I took lightly and I just kind of went into going, woohoo, I'm going to, go flying high. Nothing like that at all. So the MDMA gave me anchor points in my body for the felt sense of experiences that I'd never had. So for example, most of my life, I had an intellectual understanding of gratitude. And this finally opened my eyes to why a gratitude practice never worked for me. Because I would get up and I would do my gratitude journal and I would stick with it for weeks and sometimes months and nothing would ever change. So I just felt like I was broken beyond repair. Well, my trauma goes back to when my mother was pregnant with me because my mother was beaten, and abused while she was pregnant. And that does translate, the baby experiences that as well. It's not just the mother, that all gets transmitted to the child. So my abuse started before I ever came out of the womb and before I was, before I was ever ready to exist in air. So my body did not know how to experience anything other than the constriction that comes with fear and constant survival mode. I was in survival mode most of my life. So when I finally had MDMA and that took effect, and I don't know how I knew, but I just knew. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is what gratitude feels like to experience it. I'm like, I'm not just understanding it intellectually, I'm really experiencing it. And the experience imprinted on my central nervous system, and it gave me an anchor point. So now when I do my meditations or I do my daily practices, I have access to these feelings that people told me about and I didn't understand before. So the MDMA really gave me the felt sense of some of these positive, regenerative, renewing emotions that I didn't fully understand before because I had never experienced them. I also did a psilocybin treatment, which psilocybin is the fancy name for mushrooms, magic mushrooms. And I witnessed my ego breakdown. Like I just watched it kind of dissolve and disintegrate. And in that session, there was one point where I remember telling my facilitator I felt really annoyed because I felt like my ego had broken down and I still felt this attachment to my physical body and I just wanted to cut it. Like I didn't want that attachment anymore. And it was quite a lovely feeling. But at the end of that session, I came back to myself. But when I came back to myself, it was like this shell that everybody else who had created me, because the me that and the life that I was living at that point was not me. It was the me that everybody else in my world created. It was the me that my parents created, that my friends created. The yes person in me that would agree to anything, regardless of whether I wanted to or not. That dysfunction created this false persona that wasn't truly me. So I was finally able to pick up my life and move on in a more authentic way, being who I want to be, not who I thought other people wanted me to be. Because it wasn't really what other people wanted, it was who I thought other people wanted me to be. And that's where we get stuck in a loop too in life, especially when we're dealing with trauma. And then I also, at the tail end of a couple of my sessions, had 5-MeO DMT. And that was really a life changer. That was a game changer for me because the 5-MeO DMT was my first experience of, for lack of a better way to put it, this is how I've referred to it ever since that session, is experiencing my own divinity. Divinity is not something that's out there in the world. You don't find it going to a church. You don't find it, going to a certain, sacred site or sacred ground or anything like that. You find divinity within yourself. And it helped me find that. And again, several times since then, I have been able to reconnect with that divinity that lives within me. I hesitate to use the term God, because whatever that was that I experienced was not God as I was taught to understand it. Whatever I experienced transcended any concept that I ever had of God from church or religion or anything like that. This was not that.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you for that. And there's definitely a lot that I want to speak about and share more about in terms of what you talked about. So obviously, first and foremost, that it is something that should be therapeutic. It should be under medicinal, under therapeutic terms. It should be under supervision of clinical people doing a study or performing a psychotherapy session upon you. So it should not be something recreational. And obviously you spoke about the intention. I think that's most important. You're using it to gain and access something better out of yourself from it. And it's not necessarily just used as a substance to, feel a high. So that's definitely something that, needs to be said, because I think with a lot of the research and studies going about today, a lot of people are characterizing it strictly as, a recreational substance that people are abusing. But through a lot of these studies, and really what only the studies have been today is medicinal purposes, is therapeutic purposes for, things such as a traumatic experience, such as mental health conditions, which is definitely something that is only what these, therapy measures are going to be used for and what they should be used for. But they've been proven to have substantial benefits within, PTSD, depression, and many other issues that people face.
And psychedelics in general are not addictive. That is a myth, and that's propaganda that we have been fed. It's not the same thing as heroin or nicotine or alcohol, which are highly addictive substances. Psychedelics aren't addictive. And you don't generally get people, even with recreational use. It is few and far between that you see a daily user of psychedelics. I've met several people in my life who have used psychedelics recreationally at some point. I'm in my mid 40s, so of course I've met a lot of people in my life who've tried them. And whether they talk about it or not, it's not something they do every weekend. It's not something they do on a regular basis. I think if you meet a regular user, it is few and far between, because even with recreational use, we have this deep, deep instinctual knowing that we're in for something. And it's because I think that we're just kind of hardwired on that instinctual gut level to know that these can be beneficial to us. And why it's important to do the work and set an intention is to be ready. That way you're ready, and you're asking for parts of yourself to show up that you're ready to heal. And there might be parts of you that you're not ready to heal and that you're not ready to show up. And if you end up doing recreational use and you have a, quote, bad trip, that could just mean that you didn't set an intention, you weren't prepared, and whatever decided to eke up at the time is what eked up at the time. So it takes that level of consciousness, conscious awareness of, this is what I want answers for. And you can do that. You can learn to ask yourself, okay, this is what I want to work on right now. And that will come up for you. And all of my treatments, I didn't say this and I should have, and all of my treatments, there was an element of shamanic ceremony thrown in, where we opened the session. And even though it was psychedelic psychotherapy, there was still this element of ritual and ceremony thrown into it, because ritual and ceremony is incredibly important. And what we're realizing in somatic-based therapies, and it's starting to, filter into the Western world, is how important shamanic practices are, and they're starting to resurface because they're so darned effective. I mean, it might sound silly to go find your power animal, but I tell you what, when you find your power animal, it's powerful when you connect with that. And it really is. It's something that just, it changes things for you. It really does. It sounds silly on the surface, but until you experience it, you won't know what I'm talking about.
Definitely. And when you're speaking about these, traditions and, these rituals, it's something that's been used within psychedelics for thousands of years. I mean, and when we look at it too, it's not like psychedelics are these new and upcoming drug that's, just happening today. It's something that's been used ritually for thousands of years, and every different substance has been used, whether it's psilocybin, DMT, and such. And when you're speaking about your divinity, it sparked some insight within my brain. And what I know about DMT is, because DMT is an active chemical that's within humans. It's within your brain, and the one thing of why DMT can be used as a powerful, substance to really hit that divinity, to hit that point where you really feel, that third body perspective. You feel outside your body. You feel like you're reaching that level that you necessarily can't on a surface level, being grounded. And that as well can be triggered through a near-death experience. So through a near-death experience, when you're about to die, DMT is actually like pulsated, and there's increased levels when you're about to die. And that causes, I think, another availability of maybe that divinity, of maybe that, out-of-body experience right before your death. And it seems like that's, how DMT can be used, because it offers, I think, that change in perspective. It offers that availability to become outside yourself in order to see that maybe what you went through or what you're currently going through can offer some sort of peace, some change in perspective, and some, say, structure and order within your life that I think a lot of times some people can't necessarily go without, but it has to be done strategically and in a correct way. So, like you're saying, is you need to have that attention beforehand, and it can't be something that you say, all right, I'm going to get this question answered out of it, and I'm going to do it tomorrow. Like you said, it's got to be a process of whether it's a month or 3 months. You have to be working. You have to first get knowledgeable about what you're about to use, because you can't just walk into a ritual ceremony and say, all right, I'm going to take mushrooms. I'm going to take ayahuasca. I'm going to, do DMT. There's so many things that you need to become informed about before. And the process in and of itself is a really, I mean, it's a drooling process that you need to spend a lot of time in. And it's obviously still being researched countlessly today, but I think the benefits, the opportunities that can come out of psychedelic, assisted therapies are, exponential for a lot of people. But for some people, like you said, they can experience a bad trip per se. And for some people, if it's not evaluated correctly and they use it recreationally, a lot of people have been having, per se, the psychotic breaks, or it's been changing the way that their brain necessarily interacts throughout day-to-day habits, and it can completely change the way that they see their self. I know that necessarily there isn't too much research about it, but obviously, to debunk the pros and cons, there definitely is some negative approaches to some people that can experience it. But through a lot of the assisted research, has there really been any painful or harmful causes that have been to date? I don't believe that there's anything that has caused, whether it's, say, an overdose, or whether, say, someone led themselves to, any type of, harmful situation to themselves. I don't believe there's any recorded data upon that.
They're showing such good results that MDMA and psilocybin both are likely to be legalized in the United States and Canada within the next 2 years, because they're currently in phase 3 clinical trials, and that's the last hurdle to get past. In previous clinical trials, there's a TED talk by a guy by the name of Brad Berg, Burge, and he, I don't know what his position is, but he works for MAPS. MAPS is assisting with the clinical trials, and it's the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. In his TED talk, he talks about the 3 sessions of MDMA about a month apart and the results that they're getting. So after one session, just a single session, people with PTSD, about 20% of them were no longer diagnosable with PTSD. That's not just a reduction in symptoms. That is no longer showing signs or symptoms, no longer diagnosable, which is phenomenal for any research study. And whenever you add 3 sessions about a month apart, that number jumps to just over 60%. And when you continue to follow the participants around for a year afterwards, they continue to get better, and that number jumps to, like, I think it was 68%, so closer to 70. So the results are phenomenal. And in one of the clinical trials, they decided to stop the clinical trial in the middle of it because ethically they couldn't continue not giving the control group the psychedelics because of the results they were seeing with the group that was getting them, because it just felt unethical not to give it to the control group. So they did abandon one of the studies for that reason, because the results were just absolutely phenomenal. And it's something that can help a lot of people. Now, psychedelics are not for everybody. There are certain contraindications, so that's why it is important to do your research, to talk to a doctor. And whenever this does go legal, this is my understanding. Now, how it's actually going to happen, I'm not 100% sure, but I do know in Canada they have a couple treatment centers that have, I don't know what type of license it is, but they were able to get a license where they can start opening treatment centers prior to actual legalization. And I know that there's one, I know one in particular that's going in, and just because I have a friend who lives in that area. And in this treatment center, what will happen is you'll have to get a prescription from your medical doctor, and your medical doctor will refer you to the treatment center or to a psychotherapist who is able to assist this type of session. So you'll be sent from one professional to another professional. There will be 2 therapists in the office with you for your day-long session. You'll do sessions like pre-sessions leading up to it. You'll do post-sessions afterwards. So it's not just showing up one day and doing a psychedelic and then not having any guidance afterwards. It's nothing like that at all. And you won't be able to go to a pharmacy and get a prescription and take this home and go do it yourself. So you'll have to do your treatments at a treatment center, which is how chemotherapy is done. Like, you don't go to the pharmacy and get your chemotherapy and take it home and administer your own cancer treatments. You go to treatment centers for things like that if that's the route you choose to take. So again, know your contraindications, work with your professionals, because when this becomes legal, this really has the capacity to be a game changer for mental health. And, you know, and I wish we would stop talking about mental health disorders and, you know, diagnoses, because really none of them are disorders. They're all natural coping behaviors. And sometimes they get a little too far out of control, because with anything in life, you're going to have the fat part of your bell curve, but then the further you go out, you're going to have your standard deviations that are too far from normal that become your exceptions. You're always going to have a similar distribution to your bell curve. If you learned anything about that in school and statistics, you're always going to have that. So we're always going to have exceptions on both ends. And, you know, again, look at the contraindications, look at what works for you, and look at your belief system. If it's not something you believe in, fine, don't do it. But don't hold other people back from healing because of your limited belief in something that you're not, you know, that you don't want to do for yourself. That's not your choice to make for other people.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jennifer. I really appreciate that insight. And, you know, before we end this, I just want to express my gratitude for all the information that you've really allowed my audience to hear thus far. It's truly been a pleasure to speak with you and just tap into a little bit, a little glimpse into what you truly know and what you truly are offering, the resources that you're providing for people there today, and the sincere impact that you're making within the mental health field. It's remarkable, and it's honestly such a pleasure that we've connected thus far. And I really look forward to continuing this connection and really moving forward, continuing the collaboration, because I think you have a lot of insight to share and you have a lot of people to continue to touch. So I'm really grateful that you were able to make this work and be on this podcast, because it truly was a pleasure.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be here, and thank you for letting me share with your listeners.
Of course, it really was my pleasure. And, before we go, I have one last question that I love to ask my guests, and it's basically to wrap around your life story within a book. So if you're writing a book, the question that I like to ask is, if you were to characterize the past year or two that you've been experiencing, whether it was a certain lesson that you've uncovered, whether it's an experience that you've had, or whether it's a profound idea that you've considered thus far, what would the chapter of this past year or two been? And give us a quick glimpse as to why that would be.
So you're asking me what a chapter would be in the book?
Yeah. So if you're writing a book,
Okay.
How could you frame the past year or two? Or
Okay.
it could be yesterday.
Yeah, I would frame the past few years in my life as question everything, especially your own belief system. Because if you don't question your own beliefs and you don't test them, and you really don't put them to the test in real life, what's the use of having them? Because there's no validity to them if you don't test them out and try them and question them. So absolutely question your beliefs, get beyond the story that you tell yourself. And when you start to question your beliefs, then you start to develop a habit of self-compassion, because a lot of times our beliefs get in the way of our own self-compassion.
Thank you so much for that, Jennifer. I love that response. Self-reflective questions is something that can definitely offer insight throughout each day. I really appreciate your insight, and I look forward to speaking with you soon and having my audience listen to this wonderful episode. So thank you for being here today. It truly was a pleasure, Jennifer.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me, Brendan.